recording. And despite the relatively low attendance, hopefully people will be showing up after the city meeting. Good evening and welcome to Know Before You Grow, a subcommittee of Petaluma Urban Chat. I'm Dan Like, and as always, thanks to Dave Alden and Sharon Kirk and everybody else who puts this together. I don't see anybody. Oh no, Kevin's on here. Warning to those who are elected and appointed or otherwise accountable to the Brown Act. Be careful about serial meetings, and if you are on the meeting and wondering why somebody who's elected or appointed doesn't speak up, it's your chance to read up on the Brown Act. We have been Zoom bombed in the past. We may be Zoom bombed in the future. In fact, I got a suspicious waiting to enter the room earlier today. So if we are Zoom bombed, hang loose, and I will restart the meeting shortly. And if I'm going to turn on the waiting room, even though everybody's going to show up late. So if you know somebody who's wondering why they can't get in, tell them to chat with me. Let's see, upcoming meetings on Thursday, December 23rd, we have the monthly agenda-free gathering at noon at Aquas. If you're interested in helping us put together a future of these or just getting together and chatting, we are more than interested in having you. On Wednesday, January 12th, we are hoping to have a series on the missing middle housing. And I'm simultaneously admitting people and reading here. On Wednesday, January 26th, we're going to have a video from Chuck Marone of strongtowns.org and then local Strong Towns enthusiasts talking about that. In preparation for on February 9th, we're going to have Chuck Marone in the meeting discussing with us Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, his new book. And if you do not know Chuck Marone's in the Strong Towns organization, they're worth checking out. They've got some interesting things. With that,
Dan, can I interrupt just for a second? I know I hate to do this, Dan. I try never to do it.
Do it.
Well, the first meeting with Chuck is actually going to be on where strong towns begin, which is how to make financially strong towns. And there are a lot of comments that will be made. Yes, it'll be on video rather than live, but still, that are very pertinent to the general plan. And it's really, if you're not familiar with what Strong Towns says, it will change how you view a lot of things in city planning. So I just wanted to add the sales pitch. Sorry about that.
Excellent. Cool. And with that, I will turn this over to Teri and duck into the background and mute people when they flush the toilet and try to keep track of all the people coming in. Teri, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dan. Hi, everyone. I'm Teri Shore. And first of all, I just want to thank, Dave Alden, Dan Like, Sharon Kirk, and all the folks who are part of Urban Chat and this Know Before You Go public forum series. And I really want to thank all of the audience members because this is really a great forum that has been going on for a number of years. And you are a great audience. I attend when I can, and I just think it's one of the strongest ongoing civic community groups going on in Sonoma County. So thank you for being here and doing this. And I know I always learn something. I'm also really glad to be here with my co-panelists or co-speakers, Dan Mullen of Indy Politics, who is here in Petaluma. And after I'm going to give kind of an overview on urban growth boundaries and Petaluma, and then Dan is going to talk about campaigning and how to run a UGB campaign in general. And then we're going to finish with Robert Perlmutter of Shoot, Mahali and Weinberger. And Perl is an expert. He himself and his law firm have written virtually all of the urban growth boundary initiatives that have gone to the voters around the state. And he's on the front lines, not just in Sonoma County, but elsewhere as to what's happening with UGBs and state legislation and what we need to all be concerned about going forward. So I really, really appreciate everyone being here. I know a lot of you from my work at Greenbelt Alliance over the past 7 years. I welcome the city council members and planning commission members who are here. And I left Greenbelt Alliance back in May, so I'm a free agent now, and this is one of my first public presentations. But I really enjoy working with Dave. I really love Petaluma. And I still care a huge amount about UGBs and protecting our open space and urban planning. So, okay, now I'll get into my exciting PowerPoint. So we are going to talk today about urban growth boundaries. And the reason that we are talking about it is because Petaluma is doing its general plan update. And Petaluma's voter-approved urban growth boundary is expiring in 2025 after 27 years. It seems like a long way off, but it really isn't. So can everyone see that okay? Thumbs up? Yeah, okay. So here's just the agenda. Each of us have up to 15 minutes to talk. So we'll have no more than 45 minutes, and then we'll be opening it up to Q&A. So I'm going to cover some of the basics. I know it's a sophisticated audience, so I don't have to get too much into it, but what is an urban growth boundary? Why did we need them? Kind of the landscape of the Bay Area and Sonoma County, a little bit about community separators, and then we're going to delve down more into Petaluma itself, the history, the general plan, the UGB provisions, potential expansion areas, a touch on housing, and steps to renewal. And of course, any one of these things could be a whole presentation on their own. So why do we need urban growth boundaries, and what are they? So what an urban growth boundary is really a line on a planning map that defines where we're going to build and where we're not. It is a separator between our community, where we have our homes and our businesses, with the natural area around us. So it puts a limit on how far a community can expand. And this photo here is actually from Antioch, but it's a really, clear visual of what an urban growth boundary does. It says, okay, that's it. We're not sprawling out into the farmland and open space. And typically in the Bay Area and around the state, urban growth boundaries are voter approved, and they're set for a defined period of time, typically 20 to 30 years, because that is more or less in line with the general plans that our cities and counties put together. And the reason that they're typically voter approved is that it makes it maintains and provides the voice of the people in case there are any changes. So if a community wants to change its UGB to expand it or bring it in or change the boundaries, it has to go back out to the vote of the people. And that's very important, because if we don't have voter approval, then a city council or a board of supervisors can change the urban growth boundary with a simple majority vote. And while we have a fantastic, city council here in Petaluma right now, that would never dream of doing that, city councils change here and everywhere else. So having voter approval makes sure that the voice of the people is fully represented. And if the city council wants to go out to the people, it can. And urban growth boundaries also have different names. Usually urban growth boundaries in a city. Sometimes you have urban limit lines. Generally, I've seen those in counties. And there may be other names, but the bottom line is that it defines where we're going to build and where we're not. It doesn't tell you what to build, but where to build. So why do we need UGBs, and why did they start out in the first place? Well, the main reason, UGBs are a solution. It's a solution for open space, for health, for housing. And now we're realizing how important they are to climate resiliency, and wildfire safety. So back in the 70s and 80s, where we were growing here in Sonoma County and all over the state at a very rapid pace, and we were building houses everywhere and sprawling out. Petaluma was one of the first cities to recognize that we needed to define where our sprawl was going to stop and to protect the ag lands. And when we look to other parts of the Bay Area, you know, those stories about Silicon Valley that used to be, you know, apple orchards and peach orchards and cherry orchards. And if you look at, no, I'm not sure about cherry, but, and Los Angeles. So we saw what happened in other parts of the state where sprawl was just uncontrolled. And so the communities around California, including Petaluma, recognize that we need to do something about it. We can't just continue to sprawl out indefinitely. And so the main reason to put them in place was to prevent sprawl and to protect open space, to protect ag land around our communities. It's also a health issue because having defined areas that are urban and having our natural and open space and ag lands provides clean water, clean air, food security. It provides habitat for biodiversity, for, you know, our animals, our plants that we rely on for health, human health, also of course for recreation. Recreation and the outdoors, as we found in COVID, is essential to mental health and just for general public health. So there are lots of really good reasons for urban growth boundaries. And now we're realizing more than ever that they're also key to our climate goals and to wildfire. And again, we could do a whole presentation just on climate and greenhouse gas emissions and land use and planning. And there are a number of you here today who are experts on that. But so I'll just hit one slide, and this is from the city of Petaluma, which has been doing quite a bit of excellent work on the general plan update. There's a general plan advisory committee. There's consultants involved. So this is one of those slides. And our biggest problem in Petaluma and in Sonoma County, and really the state, is transportation, on-road transportation. Our cars, our trucks are driving around. That is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And in Petaluma, between 2010 and 2018, the proportion of GHGs contributed by driving went from 57 to 67%. So making sure that we build inside the UGB where people can, in theory, walk more and ride their bikes more and avoid driving will help reduce those GHGs. Another thing that we've recognized just in the past 5 years or so, since the big wildfires that we've experienced in Sonoma County and around our state, this is up in Fountain Grove, is that communities, urban growth boundaries and communities that are more compact and are not spread out into the wildland urban interface are far more resistant to wildfire. And we have seen that in Sonoma County. Petaluma and Rohnert Park in particular have not been hit with the type of wildfires that we've seen in communities like Santa Rosa that have spread out into the urban the wildland urban interface. Of course, there are exceptions. And as we saw up in Santa Rosa, the fire jumped the freeway and went into Coffee Park, which is in theory a compact community. But there has been science that has been done over the past 5 to 10 years. And again, this is just one slide, part of like a 35 slide presentation by an amazing researcher by the name of Alexandra Sifford. If you want to read more about where wildfire occurs and how it occurs on and in and around communities, look her up. But this is the slide that I found most impressive and easiest for me to explain, is that they did research on the location of housing and the relationship to wildfire occurrence and wildfire damage. And it seems maybe obvious, but if you look at the one end, because most of our fires are triggered by human interaction or PG&E, you know, if you're way out, you know, on huge properties, you know, giant ranches, there's less likelihood of a wildfire getting ignited, and there's less likelihood for major damage to humans or structures. And on the other end, we have our compact communities, which are generally not in the wildfire interface. And so, and it's much easier to protect these areas from wildfire and other fires if they occur. So those have the lowest relative occurrence. And in the middle, with the highest level of wildfire vulnerability and potential for damage, is the medium density spread out in the wildland urban interface. And housing location is the number, and how the houses are aligned and placed is the number one factor in determining the level of damage from a wildfire. More than the trees, more than the geography, more than the topography. And again, that's a whole nother talk. But the take home is having urban growth boundaries and sticking to them reduces your wildfire risk. Okay, how long have I been going? 7:17. I'll speed it up. So we're lucky in the Bay Area, Northern California. The Bay Area has 40 cities and counties that have adopted urban growth boundaries. Again, Petaluma was one of the first. All 9 cities in Sonoma County have passed and renewed their UGBs at least once. And in most cases, the urban growth boundaries have passed with super majorities votes from 63% to as high as 90% in Rohnert Park. And that was just like a couple of years ago. Of course, Rohnert Park has a very big urban growth boundary, and it's building a huge number of houses. That's another story. And UGBs continue to get adopted by voters across the state. Myself, as well as Dan, and also Perl and Mahoney, you know, we've helped folks in Winters, Solvang, and Gilroy, and Watsonville that are either putting them in for the first place or renewing them, because it's so important to protect our remaining open space and ag lands and build where we should be building. Sonoma County is really one of the best examples of how to work together to preserve ag land, open space, and promote city center growth. That's why everyone wants to live here now. And when you look at, you know, the North Bay, also Napa and Marin have done a really good job compared to the rest of the Bay Area. And we also have, in addition to the urban growth boundaries, which contain the cities, we have the community separators, which are county green belts that are protected on the county side, right on the other side of the UGB. And we, of course, also have an ag and open space district, which protects land through our public dollars. So maps are always hard to see on these PowerPoints, but I just wanted to show you the way Sonoma County looks right now from a planning perspective when you look at the urban growth boundaries and the community separators. And again, that's a whole nother talk, but a lot of you are familiar with the campaign we did in 2016 to expand the community separators as they were on the left from 1998 to like 2016 until 2016 when we expanded them. So you can see those green blocks are the county protected, voter protected community separators. And if you look at Petaluma, you can see that we've protected all the land between Petaluma down in Novato and some of the wetlands, and the land out on not Eli, but you know, Adobe Road. A lot of those lands are protected. Rohnert Park is completely encircled. So the gray areas are more or less the urban growth boundaries, not exactly. So it gives you a sense of kind of the yin yang between the urban growth boundaries and the community separators that makes Sonoma County the place it is today. So Petaluma's urban growth boundary, and this is a really nice view. Actually, I think I stole this from the Western Hills Petaluma Coalition. I saw Lydia is on the call, because from there, you know, that's right up by Helen Putnam, and you look back onto the city of Petaluma. In fact, I just went there yesterday to get a very similar view, and you can see Petaluma and Sonoma Mountain and Mount St. Helena. And I mean, it's just so beautiful. And the urban growth boundary is a large part of that. Again, Petaluma was ahead of the curve. The idea of an urban growth boundary dated back to the 70s, when Petaluma was growing quite rapidly. And there was a general plan policy put in that was called the Environmental Design Plan boundary. And that was not voter approved. That was put in by the city council. And then in 1987, it was updated to be an urban limit line. And then in 1998, it was put on the ballot for the first time. That, as I mentioned before, gives you voter approval to make any changes, and a 79% yes vote, 1998. So that was in place until 2018 for 20 years. But because Petaluma was updating its general plan in around 2008, what they decided to do, the community and the city council, was to renew it early, as is, as part of the general plan update, because ideally the urban growth boundary and the general plan should expire at the same time, so that you can do your planning together and renew the urban growth boundary in an orderly fashion. So the city of Petaluma put the urban growth boundary onto the ballot in 2010 and extended it to 2025, so that will align with the general plan. So it's actually a 27-year UGB. There were no changes made, and it expires in 2025, which is the timeline for the general plan. We need to renew it no later than 2024 and put it to the voters, or it will expire, and then it could be changed by a simple city council vote. So a couple more slides. The Petaluma urban growth boundary does what most of the urban growth boundaries in Sonoma County do. Draws a line where the city can expand. It protects the open space. It also has exceptions in there for affordable housing, and Perl can talk a bit more about that later. So every city has an exception to the UGB that will allow the city council, without a vote of the people, to expand it or make changes if you're not meeting your state mandated housing allocation, also known as RHNA, which would be another whole discussion. But so the reason that's so important is that in some communities, we've heard people, affordable housing advocates, say that the UGBs have prevented or stopped urban growth, have stopped affordable housing. But that's just not true, because if that were the case, the city council could go and make some exceptions to it. And the Petaluma UGB, like most of the other ones, have very strict conditions, because that's the whole point of having voter approval, is that it's not easy to change. So in Petaluma, if you needed to do that, and the city council needed to do that, you could add no more than 5 acres per year, no more than 50 acres. The land needed to be immediately adjacent to already developed areas. You would have to have adequate public services, fire, water, sewer, all the things that we need to have in our community. And there are also conditions. It needs to be at least 25% moderate and 25% low and very low. And there has to be no other land in the urban growth boundary where you could build it. So they are high bars, but if you're in a situation where you cannot meet the state housing mandates any other way, the UGB does not prevent you from doing so. Now, when I just reread the urban growth boundary for Petaluma, There are a number of other exceptions in there that aren't in a lot of the other ones. And I don't think any of the exceptions have ever been leveraged, but there are exceptions for transit-oriented development. With a 6/7 vote, you could, but it's not for housing, it's for commercial and light office space. So that's kind of interesting. There's also an exception, a 6/7 vote of the city council to add ag or ag support land to the UGB if needed. So there are like 3 or 4 pages of UGB provisions in the general plan that we're happy to send out to people. Again, that could be another whole hour-and-a-half presentation, but the bottom line is the UGB is functioning. It's doing what it's supposed to do. It's being reviewed now. And the general plan also states that one of the policies is that the city council will present a ballot measure to the community to extend the life of the existing UGB to 2025, consistent with the general plan. So there's a provision in there to expand it. I think it's beyond 2025, not to 2025. So this is what it looks like. I don't know how well you can see it, but the UGB is this red line. The city limits are in some places smaller than the UGB. There's also the sphere of influence, which should be about the same as the UGB. I don't know, there could be exceptions to that. And then there are 4 areas that were identified previously during the previous urban growth boundary initiative that could be considered for expansion. One near the proposed smart station, one over here off of Eli, or down in the south end, and over here. So that's one of the things the community is weighing in on as part of the process is, do we need to or want to expand the urban growth boundary? These are pretty small areas. I haven't heard of any other recommendations. And this is from one of the community visioning slides from some of the meetings that have been held by the GPAC and by the consultants. And the initial public input that they've recorded have ranked these particular expansion areas as don't consider, unsure, and consider. So the community input they've gotten so far is not to, am I going too long here? Let me see, I just got a text. Okay, sorry, I guess I am going too long. This is an area that the community does not want to consider. This is an area that they want to consider. This is an area that they're unsure, and this is an area they don't want to. Okay. So I am running out of time. I think I touched on the point about UGB and housing, that the UGB does not constrain housing. So we can talk more about that. Also, when it comes to affordable housing, you know, equity and environment go hand in hand. And recently the Sonoma Community Foundation did some focus groups. This was just before COVID, where they talked to folks in the community about housing and other issues. And the one really huge take home that they got was across all income levels, people were committed to staying in Sonoma County, even if it was a struggle for them. Because of what we have here, the weather, the lakes, the streams, the valleys, the hiking. So I must conclude with a timeline for all of you to think about, which is that to get the voter approved measure renewed before the UGB expires, it has to go in 2022 or 2024. And it takes time to get that on the ballot. In most communities, including the city of Petaluma, last time it was renewed, it's put on by the city council. But if it's put on by the city council and the city and the community wants to make any changes, such as adding an expansion area or changing the terms of the affordable housing or anything else, it's going to require environmental review under CEQA. And ideally, since you're doing the general plan update right now, which will require an environmental impact report, it should cover any changes to the urban growth boundary. However, if the general plan update EIR isn't done in time, and from what I can tell, the general plan is scheduled to be done by 2023, that's going to make it tight for the CEQA review to cover the UGB. So I just want to alert folks to that fact, because if you don't have a CEQA review, when the city council puts it on there, you're going to have to do a separate CEQA review for the UGB if you want to make any changes. So Perl can explain that more. He's a CEQA expert, but that has happened to us in Sebastopol, Windsor, and a few other cities, that the UGB needed to be reviewed before the general plan update and the EIR was complete. If you don't make any changes to the UGB, it's not a problem. The other option is for folks to go out and gather signatures and put the petition before the city council, and they could either adopt it directly or put it to the voters. But that's a heavy lift to get the petition gathering going. So I am so sorry if I went a little bit too long, but I did my best, and now I will turn it over to Dan.
I think it's Dan Mullen, so I will take it from here, Dan. So my name is Dan Mullen. I am a campaign consultant. I work in politics, and I've been asked to talk about the politics of UGBs. And one of the places that I wanted to start with was just in myth busting. As I think a lot of folks on this Zoom know, there's a lot of conversation amongst insiders about what needs to happen, what should happen, the direction of things. And, you know, in any community, even in a city like Petaluma, there's just a small number of people who say things, and the chattering class. So just to remind folks of the reality of the situation. So one of the myths is that UGBs are a relic of the past, that they've done their job and they're no longer needed because we're never going to sprawl like Florida or Texas or anyplace else. This is absolutely not true. UGBs are absolutely vital in terms of preserving the hillsides and green open spaces that we have now. As much as we have protected things, it is the UGBs which continue to protect things for decades to come. Another myth is that UGBs stop housing. They're anti-housing. Teri spoke to this several times, but I just want to reiterate, from a political standpoint, you will hear people say this, and it's absolutely not true. So the things that go into stopping housing and the housing crisis that we have, which is very, very real, are multifaceted. And the UGBs, for their part, support the building of affordable housing. So just keep that in mind. A third myth that I wanted to bust here is that UGBs are going to be unpopular at the ballot box because they're anti-housing, and because young people need housing, they're not going to vote for it, yada, yada, yada. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. So as we're, as you know, if people on this Zoom are supportive of UGBs, know that you are in good company, that a lot of people in your community will support you. As Teri ran down the numbers already, it's 70% plus, 80% plus, I think was City of Sonoma last year. Roanoke Park a few years ago was 90% plus. But these ballot measures are overwhelmingly popular. So that begs the question, how do UGBs get passed and renewed? Like any ballot measure, there's usually a core group of local activists or advocates, if you will. It doesn't have to be that many people. Probably folks on this Zoom have been advocates on a ballot measure campaign before. We have a couple of city council members here. Ballot measures are slightly different than city council campaigns, but if you've had a kitchen cabinet, if you've had an executive committee, you know what I'm talking about. It's a small group of local advocates that really push forward on everything that needs to happen. They help to educate people. They help to bust myths, as I've just did a few minutes ago, and they help to organize more people around the campaign who cannot commit as many hours of volunteer time as those core group of people. How does the UGB get on the ballot? Two ways, as Teri already talked about. I want to reiterate. One can be signatures. So this could be a citizens initiative. And that can be hard to do, especially as we continue to live through COVID. And two is the city council or board of supervisors can refer it back out to people, depending on if you're talking about UGBs or community separators, if it's at the county level. Most often, a city council will put this back on the ballot for citizens to consider. It's a significant savings of time, of resources for a city council to do that. And besides, most city council members are very smart people. They know that this is going to be supported by 70 or 80% of the voters. And therefore they say, I want to be with 70 to 80% of the voters, and they put it back on the ballot. And it generally passes. However, once on the ballot, you cannot take these things for granted. If the last few years have taught us anything, is that the favored candidate does not always win president. You don't always know where the voters are on every single issue. You do have to speak truth to power. You do have to advocate and make your case. And you do have to organize, you have to fundraise, you have to communicate with voters. And one of the things that is interesting about ballot measure campaigns are the arguments for and against. So if you've worked on a city council campaign, board of supervisors campaign, for example, you're used to writing your 200-word statement. Ballot measures get the same sort of treatment with more words. So you get some more words. I think it's about, 50 more words? And then, so you get 250 words, and then you get to respond to your opponent. Now, even if you're going to win a campaign, like we had very high confidence in our campaign in the city of Sonoma last year in 2020, anybody can write an argument against. And so we had somebody write an argument against, and we had to rebut that argument against. And these statements are read by about 10 to 15% of voters who tell all their friends about the arguments for and against. And so, again, even though we have very good chances of winning these campaigns for UGBs, we cannot take them for granted. We cannot take our hillsides for granted. We cannot take our open spaces for granted. And so part of the reason I love these campaigns is because they're meaningful. You know, especially for myself, I live on the east side of Petaluma. I go to Schulenberger. I go to Helen Putnam all the time. And these campaigns are things that even myself, even though I know they have a high chance of winning, I don't take them for granted, because it's just too easy to lose or to slip away. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Perl. Hopefully I made up some of Teri's time in my part of the relay.
Thanks, Dan. And I'll hop right in, and also try to move things along. I'm really hoping for some good Q&A and give and take during that. So I'll try and get us to that part of my planned remarks overlapped with what the prior speaker said. In any event, as Teri mentioned, my name is Perlmutter. I'm a land use and environmental attorney, partner at Shoot Mahaly and Weinberger in San Francisco, and a significant part of my work involves the drafting and defense of and processing of land use initiatives on behalf of both community groups and public agencies up and down the state, all over the state. I and my partners have drafted, I don't think it's quite all the UGBs, but it's many dozens of ballot measures throughout the state, including at one point we worked on all of the measures, the original measures in Sonoma County, as well as a county-wide measure that was meant to work in conjunction with the UGBs, but ultimately was, unfortunately, the county-wide measure was rejected by the voters. So while you do have your community separated measure, there was a Napa County style measure in Sonoma County in the late 90s that failed. So I want to talk just a little bit about the big picture, a little bit about the evolution of UGB initiatives, and talk about some of the current trends and challenges, and then and where I see things going, and then finish up and we can open it up for questions. And I'll just following up on something Dan said, as someone who's committed their life to practicing this area of the law, both with initiatives and other land use issues, I'm hyper aware of the limitations and the faults of initiatives and of most other laws and virtually everything we do to try and protect the environment and everything we do to try and make democracy function. But for all their faults and limits, initiatives are, they're in my view, simply one of the most effective tools that we have for limiting sprawl, for protecting open space and agricultural lands, and for when done properly, which is not the case, but when done properly, for really giving teeth to what long-range planning is all about, in my view. And also in terms of the campaigns, one of the beauties of initiatives on the local level, and I don't think this is true at all at the statewide level, is you can really engage, one can really engage in meaningful dialogue with your neighbors. One can really overcome being massively outspent 10 or 100 or 1,000 to 1 by your opponents on the other side through community engagement and going door to door. And I've just seen that happen repeatedly throughout the state. So to launch into the history, in my view, particularly in the Bay Area, the impetus for urban growth boundaries really began with county-wide measures, not city-based measures, but county-wide measures to protect farmland in the early 80s. And these measures, by and large, were focused on saying where development should not go. It should not go on prime ag land. It should not go in unincorporated areas of the counties that don't have the infrastructure to support open space. So the first example we were involved with was a farmland protection measure in Solano County in 1984 that preserved farmland in the county by readopting and basically locking in place really good policies that have been adopted by the Board of Supervisors through the general plan, but were subject to change at any moment. And that really became the model for a number of other jurisdictions, including Napa County, where the first Measure J was adopted in 1990. In that case, ended up going up to the California Supreme Court in a famous case called DeVita versus Napa County. It really became clear for the first time that both at the county and the city level, you could amend your general plan by initiative to either put in place an urban limit line or preserve agricultural land through your general plan. And up until then, we had spent 15 years battling with the development community and some local jurisdictions over whether or not that was even legally viable. The Supreme Court said it was. And that really, from my firm's perspective and our experience, led directly to the adoption of the UGBs beginning the very next year in 1996, working with Greenbelt Alliance, other local groups, to start drafting urban growth boundary initiatives, many of which just reaffirmed existing or readopt and slightly change existing general plan policies. And within a couple of years, there were adopted urban growth boundaries in every city in the county. It's one of the few counties in the state that actually has that. And it's been just quite an effective a measure of preserving open space. Both the countywide measures and the urban growth measures, a big part of what they actually did was said where growth cannot go. And they outright prohibited urban growth for the UGBs outside the urban growth boundary. And the countywide measures had the same effect by basically readopting large lot minimum parcel sizes, 1 unit per 180 acres or 60 acres or 360 acres, and basically made it impossible without voter approval to have urban sprawl, urban level development in those unincorporated areas of the counties or outside the urban growth boundaries. But the operative tools of those really, for the most part, were in the early years to say where growth could not go. And that was really one of the three main elements common to all urban growth boundaries. Outside of the UGB or the urban limit line or whatever it was called, urban growth could not go. It was usually prevented either by an outright prohibition on extending urban services, water, sewer, et cetera, those areas, or to simply expressly prohibiting urban growth. And they also required voter approval to change that. And so really was an effective mechanism of locking that in. The second is the UGBs, unlike the county measures, adopted policies that encourage urban growth to be within the boundary. So that almost every UGB we worked on would have both findings where the voters declared they have found that urban growth makes more sense to put inside of city limits where infrastructure is more readily available, where there's already services to serve those. But most UGBs didn't actually require housing to be built anywhere. They could, but simply they didn't. They left that up to the city council to implement. They made findings, which I think are true, that would be more cost effective, but they basically encouraged and implemented those policies by prohibiting the growth from going elsewhere. And the third thing that was common to all of the UGBs and still is they tend to have some sort of policies or exceptions to both encourage or ensure compliance with state housing law. There's no legal requirement to do this, and not every UGB actually does that. It's something my firm recommends to be put in every urban growth boundary to make it more legally defensible and frankly better policy, but it's not legally required. And sometimes you'll see pushing people for any number of reasons. They don't trust the city council. They think we've already got too much housing, whatever it is. They'll kind of draw in a line in the sand. I don't recommend that. And for reasons I'm going to get to, I think that's more and more dangerous given what's happening at the statewide level and with the courts on housing issues. And so, but making sure a UGB complies with state housing law is a big part of what we do, both in drafting UGB measures and in working with clients to explain the process to them and make it so that there's language in the UGB so we can make that argument through the ballot arguments and in the campaign, as Dan discussed. And there's a lot that goes into that, but you need to consider both existing levels of development and projected levels of development, what your RHNA allocations, the regional housing need allocations, what's going to be required. And then, as Teri mentioned, to provide exceptions for the city council without having to go to the voters if state law were to require it to provide for housing that's required by state law. And this is one of those areas where the law has changed a tremendous amount since the late 90s when the Petaluma UGB initiative was adopted. Our housing exemptions now are much different than they were in 1998. And if whoever's working on the Petaluma UGB, what I would urge you, either whether it's through us or someone else, but take a look at the housing exemptions. It's the state legislature every year is adopting more and more laws that constrain the ability of local governments, including the local voters, to limit or prevent housing. And so it may be that what worked and was legal in 1998 is no longer legal in terms of what you need to allow. So those things really need to be revisited. I want to just say a couple of quick words, because I know we're a little bit behind, on the difference between council-sponsored and voter-sponsored measures. And then I'll stop there. But there are three big differences between council-sponsored and voter-sponsored measures. Voter-sponsored measures are not subject to CEQA, period. Full stop. Never. If a measure is put on the ballot through the signature gathering process, it is simply not subject to CEQA, period. And more than that, if it even qualifies, a voter-sponsored measure qualifies for the ballot, and the city council then chooses to adopt it rather than place it on the ballot, once enough signatures are gathered, the council can do that, and they don't need to comply with CEQA. Supreme Court has made that absolutely clear. So that is the key difference. For the council to put a measure on the ballot on its own, even a UGB renewal, the council needs to comply with CEQA. In many cases, because of nuances of CEQA, if they're simply renewing a measure, complying with CEQA doesn't mean you have to do anything, but that's not a given. And so even if it's just a straight up renewal, a developer or someone else opposed to the straight up renewal could say, hey, wait, council, you're subject to CEQA, which is true. And unlike the last time you did this, for the following reasons, is a potentially significant environmental impact if you were readopting this, and therefore you need to comply with CEQA, council, before you can put it on the ballot. I can, if there are questions, I can follow up on that, but and there are defenses to that, but the bright line rule is anytime the city council voluntarily puts its own measure on the ballot, it is subject to CEQA. There may be nothing to do under CEQA, but it is subject to CEQA. Whereas a voter-sponsored measure, no matter what it does, is, including if it's a developer-sponsored voter initiative, it's not subject to CEQA. The other thing is, and I think I just briefly alluded to this, again, if it goes through the voter-sponsored route and it qualifies for the ballot and it is adopted either by the council or by the voters, at that point, after it qualifies for the ballot, has enough signatures, then it cannot be changed without voter approval. Even if the voters don't adopt it, as long as it qualified for the ballot through the signature gathering process, if the council adopts it voluntarily, once it qualifies, it cannot thereafter be changed except by the voters, even though the council adopted it. Whereas for a council sponsored measure, that's not true. If the council sponsors it and adopts it on their own, they can change it later. If a council sponsored it and the voters adopt it, then only the voters can change it. So I wanted to be clear. And the last thing is, both Teri and Dan alluded to this, the process for gathering signatures, it's difficult. It takes time, it takes organization, it takes money, but you do have 180 days from when you get the official title and summary and can begin circulating to gather signatures. We worked with two different cities, one in Northern California, Winters, and another one, the city of Solvang, both small cities that managed to gather signatures to qualify measures, UGB measures, for the ballot during the height of COVID. So, and in about 45 days, each of them did that. So it's hard, it's not easy. Those folks busted their butts, but it is doable. And if you're in a time situation where there's not enough time for the city to complete CEQA compliance, or there are all kinds of other things that go on, as long as you leave yourself enough time to actually draft the measure, it is a viable option. It's just more work. I had a lot more to say about state housing law, but I think I'll stop there so we can answer people's questions.
Well, so far we've only got one kind of extended question. So we might get back around to state housing law because I'm interested in that too.
Okay.
But the initial question might be for Teri, but anybody can jump in here. On the options to modify the urban growth boundary by council vote, are transit-oriented development and commercial or transit oriented residential, I think is where this was going, and commercial office options separate, or is it transit oriented development that includes only commercial space? The continuation is, if the TOD option can include residential, that would seem to make a general plan change to include the Scott Corona Station adjacent property less necessary because the council could make that decision later.
That's a very good question. And when I read the UGB and the general plan documents, it looked to me as though it was only commercial and office, light office, and it was not residential. So I'd have to revisit it. And again, this was written 20 years ago, and So at that time, it's very possible that there was a need or a perceived need for commercial and office. And at that time, TOD didn't include. So let me just look it up while we're talking and see if I can get the exact text, and I'll put it, well, I can't put it in the chat. Maybe you can put it in the chat.
Well, you could fire it to me and I can copy it back. And
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so
and you know
I'll
what?
look for it.
We can also just open up the chat here and see what happens. Hopefully it won't become a disaster. Yeah, Pearl, you had more on the on state housing law, because that sure seems like it's getting really interesting these days.
Yeah, it's getting really interesting. And I one of the things I do in my spare time is try and fight misguided or bad laws in Sacramento, and that's been a lot of time the last couple of summers. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples. It's really going back to 2018. For the first time, the legislature has taken direct aim in a substantive way at local ballot measures. There's been legislation that in the past that it's placed limits on them, but it's really taken a dramatic turn in the last 3 or 4 years. And I wanted to give a couple of examples, cautionary examples. And so I'll launch into that, and then Dan, whoever's moderating, if we, if other questions come up that seem more interesting, I'm happy to stop from that. But so I have 3 examples. One is Senate Bill 330, which was adopted in 2019. And amongst other things, it prevented any general plan amendment or rezoning that would have the effect of reducing density over what was allowed as of January 1st, 2018. So it was a law that took effect January 1st, 2020, but any general plan amendment or rezoning in that intervening window that would reduce density over what was allowed on January 1st, 2018 was preempted by state law, and including any initiatives. And so this happened to apply to an urban growth boundary initiative that the voters adopted in the city of Antioch, which actually did reduce density for a portion within the city within the urban growth boundary. That's not something we do. My firm typically does in initiatives that we draft, and we didn't draft this, but some do, and it was perfectly permissible legally. And this was in a city that had plenty of space to meet its RENA needs. But after the measure qualified for the ballot, after it was first supposed to appear on the ballot, but wasn't because of one of 5 lawsuits filed against it, we defeated 4 of those lawsuits. Eventually it appeared on the ballot, but after this bill took effect, and then the 5th lawsuit was filed after the voters adopted, after the measure took effect, and the initiative ended up being struck down, even though it was perfectly legal when it was written and when it was qualified for the ballot, because it ran afoul of this provision of SB 330. Ironically, the one provision of the UGB that survived the legal challenge was the renewal of the urban limit line, which is extended indefinitely. So that survived, and that was a victory for the UGB. But this other portion of the initiative that was perfectly legal when it was drafted was struck down because of this piece of legislation. And that early slide that Teri showed, that the specific project that this provision of the initiative was struck down on was the definition of a sprawl development. It was out in the middle of nowhere in gorgeous rolling hills, open space, surrounded on 3 sides by East Bay Regional Park districts, and on the other side by open space. And SB 330, which was designed ostensibly, according to the authors, to encourage infill development, basically provided a bulldozer for a developer to overturn an initiative that would have stopped that sprawl development. These are the kind of things you need to be aware of when you're drafting initiatives and making sure you don't run afoul of. There were 2 bills last year, one of which Dan was very helpful, along with another group of local activists up and down the state, in stopping but Assembly Bill 1322 last year would have given every city council and every board of supervisor throughout the state the ability to ignore and not enforce any voter adopted initiative if that city council or board of supervisors made a finding that, in their opinion, the initiative, quote, conflicted with any provision of state law relating to housing. And so it would have meant you adopt your UGB, the city council makes a finding, in its view, it conflicts with state housing law, they wouldn't have had to comply with that UGB. You could have gone to court to challenge that, but otherwise, unless you were successful, that would have been the law. That bill passed the assembly. A very good, very environmental, good friend of the environment, actually was the lead author of it. And we got word of it late in the legislative process, and a whole bunch of activists up and down the state were able to exert pressure to get the Senate to stop that bill. But that very nearly came, I viewed that as an existential threat to urban growth boundaries throughout the state. And then the last bill, also from last year, was SB 10, Senate Bill 10, you might have heard about. Very controversial bill. Plenty of people that I work closely with feel either support it or oppose it, but basically that allows any city to adopt an ordinance to upzone a single parcel, even if it's just one residential unit allowed in that parcel now, to allow, the bill says up to 10 units, it's really up to 14 units that would be allowed on any single parcel, notwithstanding any initiative that provided otherwise, as long as that parcel falls within a transit-rich area or an urban, quote unquote, urban infill site. Most UGB initiatives arguably would not run afoul of this because it's designed to encourage more density on infill sites, but the definition of infill site particularly of transit-rich areas is pretty broad, and it could easily apply to some areas that I suspect many people on this call wouldn't think of as infill. But again, the legislature just said, we don't care if you adopt an initiative, it doesn't matter if the city council does this, that will be overridden. That bill, SB 10 right now, is subject to litigation. It's going to be tied up in for years in the courts. Who knows whether or not it's going to be upheld, but we are going to see more state legislation like this. And so love it or hate it, one of the things it just means is things that you can't just copy urban growth boundary or other initiatives that were done in the past. And trust me, this is not a plug to hire me. It's just a plug to make sure that if you're doing a UGB, either the city attorney or someone else who knows what they're doing gets involved to make sure you don't go through all the effort and just have it struck down.
Cool, thank you. We have another question in, and after that, we'll, Teri also sent me an update on the other, but the question was that the VMT changes, which I believe were to CEQA, seem to be doing the same tasks as the urban growth boundary. Can you talk about the distinctions and does the urban growth boundary provide a belt and suspenders backstop to the VMT analyses?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. Yeah, so my view is it's kind of apples and oranges. The VMT maybe is intended to get at making us be more accountable for sprawl development that encourages more, and VMT is vehicle miles traveled. I assume most people on this know this, but
thank you.
We're trying to make us more accountable for it, but it doesn't say you can't build housing out in the middle of nowhere that will cause much more, and it doesn't protect open space land, it doesn't protect ag land. In my view, it doesn't prevent sprawl. UGBs, if they're all done, just prevent those things. So you could call it belt and suspenders, but to rely on just on CEQA requirements about VMT to me is not, it's not prudent.
Okay, cool. And then I've been trying to read and pay attention, and my mind cannot do two things at once. I'm tossing Teri's note in the chat generally, copying it twice. And I have an additional note in here that as soon as I get this second one copied and pasted, there are Petaluma sites well inside the urban growth boundary that fail to comply with the VMT threshold. So that sounds like belt and suspenders to me. If we can get them both ways, that's good.
Yeah, on the question about the Corona land, I did look at this. It's a very long provision, but it does look like residential would be allowed with a 6/7, an expansion to include transit-oriented development with residential. This is some of the actual language on the exception, 6/7 vote of the city council. but there's quite a few provisions in there. And if you read it in the chat, it does say transit-oriented residential and local serving commercial. It talks about the services that need to be provided. It needs to be within 1,500 feet of a rail transit station. So I don't know if a proposed rail transit station would meet that or not. You could argue that. And then there's a whole bunch more language in there. It needs to provide employment, and there's also some specific areas that could be considered, such as, which I didn't put in there, it mentions the potential expansion areas of the UGB. So it sounds like that the exception could be made if it aligned with all the conditions and it was in one of those already identified extension areas. So in theory, yeah, probably you could deal with that later instead of expanding the UGB and having to do CEQA, or doing, a mitigated neg deck instead of, whatever version of environmental review you could do. So it's not super black and white in my mind.
Cool. And another comment to me, the state keeps overriding local housing policy, likely because local housing is in crisis, which certainly meshes with my vision of what's going on. Can we both support urban growth, boundary, and infill housing? Most folks only get involved to stop things, not to support new housing. Is there a way to inspire people to hold those two things at once in their thinking? And I'll let anybody who's got an insight on that take it.
I'll take a stab at it since it seems like a bit of a political question. It's definitely something that we were supportive of in the city of Sonoma in 2020, for example, where we were supportive of more infill housing and more affordable housing. Part of the complications come into play because you're dealing with developers, and developers will want to get the best deal possible for themselves. Listen, I work with politicians, so for me to cast aspersions on developers when I work with politicians is kind of funny, but they're not, they don't have the best reputations of being honest and forthright. But at the same time, yeah, if we can be supportive of more housing development, it's the right type of housing and development. It's not, I'm going to talk for myself for a second. It's not just McMansions or large single family homes, but it's actual housing that working families can afford. I'll be with you. And so it can get tricky because it's not like you can say, hey, let's put an affordable housing development on the ballot like you can with a UGB. They're kind of apples and oranges in that respect. But in terms of coalition building, yes, it can and does happen.
Yeah, and I would strongly second that. I am quite passionate about trying to build coalitions and bridges so that we can have both housing, particularly affordable housing, but also housing in general, and protection of the environment. I think it's a false dichotomy that we need to choose between one or the other. I think there's lots of places in which they work together. I'm working with a number of different groups trying to build coalitions, both at the statewide level and at local level, but in trying to work with progressive people in the legislature to come up with statewide housing bills that actually will result in housing getting built rather where it needs to go and should go, rather than just removing limits on sprawl development, which I think is at odds with our greenhouse gas emission and climate change goals. And unfortunately, I think we all know, or almost, I'll speak for myself, I know we are in a housing crisis, right? That's real. No one's making that up. There's all kinds of reasons for that. One unfortunate side effect of that in the state legislature is that if anyone who comes in with a bill that says this is pro-housing, it sails through. I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but it does. And to be opposed to that bill or point out the unintended consequences of that, you're already in a defensive role where, trying to work on bills that would bring some of our massive budget surplus, some of the tons of private and hedge fund money in our state that people are just desperate to invest in something productive, with laws that streamline the ability to put housing where it makes sense to put it, that environmentalists could support. That's my passion. I'm working on that. It's slow going, partly for some of the reasons Dan mentioned. There are lots of other people who want to do other things, but it's in theory that should be easy to do. It's not so easy to do, but I do think it's doable.
Yeah, I mean, one case in point that's happening right now over in Sonoma Valley, where I live, is the Sonoma Developmental Center, transformation development, however you want to call it. And the state legislature has given the county the authority to put together a specific plan and the funding to do it. And the legislation basically is asking for everything: protect open space and build housing, and it has to be financially feasible. And the idea that the state has is that we'll just sell it to a master developer who will take all that over. And I can't get into a whole discussion about it, but what the county came up with is for like 1,200 single family home subdivision on undeveloped land in the middle of a rural area in the middle of Sonoma Valley that has no transit and no services and no, it's really the worst possible place to put a big subdivision of single family homes and a hotel. At the same time, what everyone has just said about the affordable housing crisis, and I think they've committed, the plan is suggesting like 25% affordable. So, everyone in Sonoma Valley is freaking out about it. On the other hand, you hear so many people in public comments saying, my family is going to have to move, or we have a hard time living here, the things that we're hearing, which is very real. So if you speak up for the open space and say we shouldn't be building there, we should be building in the Springs or the city of Sonoma or the city of Petaluma, how about that? You're automatically called as anti-housing and worse. So it's very challenging at this time on many fronts.
Thank you. I have no further questions in my inbox here, and I'm not even, I think I need to sit and let some of this all percolate in before I can, try to figure out okay, how do we start putting together an organization to gather signatures? Because, yeah, I'm the guy who does the Zoom sessions under duress, let alone other organizing. So given that, and given that we've gone for an hour and a quarter, I think maybe it's time to thank you all very much. Thank you, Teri and Perl and Dan. Really appreciate this. And thank you everybody else for coming. I realize we had a slightly light night tonight, but hopefully everybody was over with the district elections meeting before this. And with that, I will let you all get on with your evenings. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Perl and Dan.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
everybody. Great.
Very
Great job.
informative. Thank you so much.
Thanks.